Okay, in the last video, I talked about the NATO conference and I described like the timeline that Zelenskyy wanted. It's just impractical. It has to be based on certain criteria being met, not on a particular time. Otherwise, it can go very wrong very quickly. I also talked about how the map has changed, right? Russia doesn't have a clear way out of this European ports either here or if he loses Crimea down here, and that's going to be a real problem for him. In this video, I want to show you reaction to the NATO conference. I'm going to show you some from CNN, and I'm going to show you some from RT, and it'll be pretty different. You'll see what I'm talking about. So stay with me all the way to the end. Okay, here's the interaction on CNN, and we're going to watch CNN first. Just a little clip.
We are joined now by former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dodler. He is the CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us. You've had this job, right? This sort of tough job of being the top diplomat from the U.S. to NATO and dealing with some of these sensitivities. Knowing that, what are those sensitivities of communicating with Ukraine right now about its desire to be a member of NATO?
So there are really two sensitivities, Brianna, that are important here. One is what Natasha mentioned. The reality is that there is not a single NATO country that today wants Ukraine into NATO, because if Ukraine were to be a member of NATO today, then NATO would be obliged to defend.
Right. Now, they're not anti-Ukraine. They just aren't trying to kick off World War III.
Every inch of Ukrainian territory, and it isn't prepared to do that. It hasn't been prepared since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and it's not prepared to do so now. So that's one problem. If you lay out a timeline that says NATO will invite Ukraine once the war is over, you actually give an incentive to the Russians to continue fighting.
And that's a really important point. If you do lay out that timeline, then what does that do to Russia? In the last video, I asked you twice to put yourself in Putin's shoes. Yeah, that's a really weird thing. If you try to play from the other side and try to understand that, that's not going to work well.
For as long as they can therefore prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. So that's the dilemma that they are playing with. The second piece is that there is disagreement among allies about whether Ukraine, even if there was not a war, is today ready to join the alliance. As Natasha said, great step forward. By NATO, Ukraine no longer needs a membership action plan, but it does need to demonstrate that its democracy is strong and vibrant, that it has dealt with corruption in the way that has defined the state for so long. And those are areas that need to be worked out. And NATO is prepared, and the leaders said they were prepared to help Ukraine move along.
Okay, so he talked about that it smoothed the path by removing one of the steps, but they still need to show certain things are in place. So it did actually move them forward, and that should have been the headline, but the headline became Zelensky's angry that they're not getting in right now. I get it. If I was Zelenskyy, I'd probably be angry too, because I want in right now. But at the same time, this was a great move forward. They do have to demonstrate these certain things. Now, I've also wondered about this. NATO was formed here because of the Cold War, because of what Russia was doing. If you roll the clock back about 2 decades before this, it was Europe at war with Europe, right? So it was Germany at war with France and England and taking over most of the continent, and Russia fighting against Germany, and it was a whole big mess. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I wonder how long NATO can hold up, or at what point countries within NATO will decide for whatever reason to go to war with other countries. Like, part of what's holding up Turkey's EU membership is that, well, Turkey had some incident with Cyprus some time ago. That was an EU country, and that wasn't really a cool kind of thing. So I just wonder how long NATO can hold up, given the potential internal conflicts that could become all kinds of problems, given the size and the number of countries that it is. Okay, let's keep going.
That's where we are. An absence of agreement within the alliance about how far Ukraine has come, and the reality that a country at war is not necessarily a great ally to bring into an alliance at this point in time.
And those are all fair points. Okay, let's see just a little bit more here.
You see NATO more united than ever, expanding. We've heard that from member nations that since this war has begun, NATO has only gotten bigger. It has defied Vladimir Putin's expectations. Is his war essentially backfiring on him?
First of all,
Yeah, and it was the animal square dance, right? It's just, and if you don't know what the animal square dance is, go back to my last video. I talked about the animal square dance, and that's what Putin was counting on. And he had good evidence to think that that was the case. But this will go down. So Putin wants to be in the history books, right? He wants to be thought of as, you know, Peter the Great and Vladimir the Great and whatever. Well, he'll be in the history books, but I don't think it's going to be the way that he wants to be.
oh, absolutely. This will be seen as one of the greatest strategic failures in history. The idea that you could invade a country, take it over, and that the rest of the world would stand by and let it happen, which clearly was what Putin was banking on, has proven to be an utterly disastrous calculation. First of all, they weren't able to take over Ukraine. The Russian military has suffered incredible losses, both in personnel and, of course, in the capabilities. It is a much diminished army. Secondly, it now faces a Ukraine that is united, completely united behind the idea of Ukraine as an independent nation that belongs to the West. And third, they face a NATO that is bigger, larger, with a stronger capability along Russian borders, and that is committed to remaining the defensive alliance dominant with the kinds of military spending that is now forthcoming for the long term. You can't think of anything worse when you think about where Russia is sitting today compared to where we're sitting on the 23rd of February, 2022.
Okay, so Putin has united Ukraine in a way that could never have happened. Like, let's set aside NATO. He brought together much of Ukraine that was opposed to each other, right? They were kind of at odds with each other, but since 2022, most of Ukraine is on the same page in opposition to Russia. Putin has revitalized, breathed fresh life into the faltering NATO alliance that was just kind of barely getting by on life support. And that was Putin that did that, right? Like, if he had just left it alone, NATO might have kind of just fallen apart over time. So Putin, and these were both unintended consequences. This was not what he was trying to do. But there's a third thing. Like, it's absurd to the degree that Putin has created this kind of thing. And I was half joking in my mind when I was reading an article the other day about President Duda of Poland and Zelenskyy were together at a memorial about Ukrainian atrocities in Poland during World War II, and how they've put this aside. They're saying, look, we're brothers, we're together, we're in this together. And it's almost like you could solve the Middle East crisis between Israel and Palestine if you could just convince Putin to invade Palestine. Like, I'm being facetious, but just think about what Putin has actually done and the unintended consequences that he's reaped from that. Okay, let's move on and see what RT has to say. So here's RT, and here's an American-voiced commentator.
The invitation will be issued when conditions are met. Then I would like to add that on top of that, of course, allies are also providing substantial military support, because the most urgent task now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails, because unless Ukraine prevails, there is no membership issue to be discussed at all. And if you look at other membership processes, there have not been time lines for those processes. They are conditions-based.
Okay, so what RT has shown here is absolutely fair. This is the way it works. This is Jens Stoltenberg being on message, talking about what should have been the message rather than what became the message.
Always been.
You must be aware of this. If Ukraine were admitted to NATO today, during the conflict, it would first demand that Article 5 be proclaimed. Then other allied states would have to help defend Ukraine. That would mean war.
If Ukraine was admitted into NATO right now, then not only would it risk a world war, but NATO also wouldn't be able to pretend that it was just a helpful bystander egging on and arming Ukraine against Russia. So much for their David and Goliath narrative, which would automatically become a Goliath against Goliath narrative, which really wouldn't serve their narrative purposes too well. And as Secretary General Stoltenberg said,
So I'm not sure what the narrative purposes mean, but how many NATO soldiers have died in this war?
the most imminent task is to keep the weapons rolling in for Ukraine. Why? Well, it just happens to divert billions upon billions of Western taxpayer cash into the pockets of weapons manufacturers in the West. Makes sense when you consider that NATO is really just a massive lobby for the Western military-industrial complex, and Ukraine is really just...
No, I heard this yesterday, and I thought, that is such a bizarre way of approaching this. Like, you could come at this from so many different angles, but why come at it from the, Western industrial arms supplying, and then it struck me that this is what Wagner does in Russia. So what Wagner has done historically was they'd go and they'd fight in these wars, but they were really a conduit to sell Russian arms. I mean, as much as they were a private military contractor doing a fight, they were also buying Russian weapons. And they're not that valuable in doing that because Russia's running out of their own Russian weapons. They're not really trying to sell Russian arms. They're trying to keep their Russian arms right now. But that's the perspective through which Russia sees Wagner, and maybe that's why she's pushing this narrative of NATO, because this is not like how NATO thinks about its own self.
It's a pretext that gives them a green light to stuff their pockets through emotional blackmail of Western citizens who are constantly being made to believe that it's really the only way to peace. So,
well,
no
it kind of
NATO
is,
wedding...
because it is the only way to peace, because the alternative is just inviting more war
on the horizon for Ukraine, or even an engagement. Cancel the cake if anyone ordered one. The Lithuanian president stepped in with a bit of a romantic poem, I guess you could say, maybe a haiku, about this toxic relationship between Kiev and the West.
EU wants to put a situation where Ukraine's NATO membership becomes a horizon. The more you get closer, the more it moves forward from you.
It sounds like the last line of a really frustrating French romance movie, the kind that ends without anyone in the audience really knowing what the couple's fate ended up being. Well, Ukrainian president...
But I don't know why she belabored that. It just is saying that it feels like the goalposts have moved, and I mean, that was it. I mean, I can understand. If I was Zelenskyy, if I was Ukraine, I would be frustrated too. I get it.
President Vladimir Zelenskyy, a former actor himself, says that he wants nothing to do with this script.
It's unprecedented and absurd when there is no time frame for either an invitation or Ukraine's membership, and when instead some strange wording is added about conditions even for inviting Ukraine.
Okay, so with that, I've got to say that this feels like 2008 again. So in 2008, we started, NATO was talking about inviting Ukraine, and this is where Putin sat up and took notice and was going... and at a 2008 conference said, rebuked the West and took a harsh tone and kind of turned a corner. And I think this is where Putin decided he was against the West. NATO was saying one day you'll be in Ukraine, but they didn't say today. It would have been better just to shut up at the time and be quiet and talk through back channels rather than to make these pronouncements. And it kind of feels like deja vu with that.
It looks like there is no readiness either to invite Ukraine to NATO or to make it a member of the alliance.
And there's not during the war. And again, if I was Zelenskyy, I would be frustrated as well. But you just can't do that right now.
He showed up fully expecting some kind of a ring, engagement, wedding, whatever. And NATO didn't even give him one of those little plastic ones with the hard candy sucker on top. Well, speaking of being suckered,
she's a piece of work, isn't she?
The State Department spokesman also had a bit of a Freudian slip that suggests a real disconnect with Washington's public proclamations of love for Ukraine.
We believe the war has been a strategic failure for Ukraine. The secretary spoke to this in a speech he gave in Helsinki last month, I believe it was. What's that? I'm sorry, a strategic failure for Ukraine. Thank you for the correction. Which is...
Again?
He obviously meant to say Russia, but just couldn't manage to get it out, despite having a couple of shots at it. Only the best and brightest in Washington.
I'm sure that's getting plenty of airtime in Russia right now.
Zelenskyy has to settle for some hugs and some pats on the back, the usual. He really has become for NATO what that clown Ronald McDonald is for McDonald's restaurants, a mascot meant to drum up business and keep the cash rolling into the right pockets. But none of it is really good for the well-being of the average person, particularly Ukrainians.
I couldn't
I
couldn't disagree with her more on that, on her assessment of him being Ronald McDonald. He is for NATO what Churchill was in World War II. He's the epicenter, or the spokesperson for the epicenter of the conflict, and it's not just a mascot. That's ridiculous. Okay, so that's how RT was playing this. And so I just wanted you to see these perspectives and be able to understand what is actually happening, why it's happening, and then what Russia's saying about it. All right, that's all that I have. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the coffees. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope you will be too.